Hitler has long been known as a far-right figure. In the past couple decades, however, fact has become fiction and fiction has become fact. The fiction that Hitler was actually a leftist hell-bent on destroying the capitalist system and replacing it with a Marxist utopia has steadily been chipping away at the reality that he was a far-right figure essential for preserving capitalism and preventing a German socialist revolution. A couple months ago, I stumbled across a video created by PragerU where Dennis Prager, in a very short amount of time, tries to alchemically turn fiction into truth.
Hitler was left-wing in that he believed in socialism. Remember, Nazism is National Socialism, but that is what Nazism stands for, National Socialism. And by the way, he hated capitalism. He hated it. Not one person I know is a racist.
I still have a hard time understanding how he managed to fit so much disinformation into such a short video, but it bothered me enough that I spent the next 4 months researching whether or not Hitler really was a socialist, despite this being an obvious misrepresentation of reality. The more ridiculous and bold a claim, the more damage it can do, and one thing right-wing propagandists are good at is making people question fundamental facts. One of these ridiculous claims states that since Hitler included the word socialist in his party name, he must have been entirely sympathetic to the socialist revolution. In 1920, Hitler did formally change the original name of his party, the German Workers' Party, into the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Did he do this because he wanted to honor Karl Marx and behead all rich people? Not exactly. After the wreckage of World War I and a multitude of communist revolutions across the European continent, German citizens were among the many Europeans who found communism to be an attractive alternative to their current political economies. In Weimar Germany, right before Hitler took power, the Social Democratic Party was failing to protect Germans from the rise of fascism, which had spread like a virus from Italy. The Social Democrats were spineless, brainless, and utterly lacking in solutions to curb the wreckage of the Great Depression, leaving a wide open hole for Nazis to fill in. As the economy continued to swallow hopeful dreams of the future, radical alternatives grew fertile. Communism was the most popular of those alternatives. Before Hitler rose to power in 1933, over 18 million Germans had voted for either a socialist or a communist party. Hitler, despite hating the very essence of communism, as we will later see, knew he stood no chance of gaining power if he ostracized so many potential voters, and so he had to fake it until he made it. This is the reason he called this party the National Socialist German Workers' Party, to attract as many voters as he possibly could. But does the name of a political party really reveal what they are all about? As we will see, actions speak much louder than words. Conservatives try to argue that no party would claim to be something it is not. Therefore, National Socialism must be socialist. If this is the case, would people like Crowder or Prager agree that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a champion of democracy? Would they safely conclude that the American Democratic Party would never dare do anything undemocratic? A name is hardly enough information to determine what a political organization is in actuality. If I was a wannabe dictator, I would surely call my party the extremely democratic, totally not a dictatorship, people's freest democracy party with zero corruption, plus please trust us and ask no questions. The truth is that the Nazis spoke with a forked tongue. They would have said or done anything to get into power, and one of these tactics included donning the sheep's clothing of socialism to conceal their true wolfish goals. The Nazis co-opted leftist language to make people believe they were part of a movement that benefited the masses instead of the rich minority. "We are in this together, and together we can take down the elite," Hitler would say. Fascism appealed to the most urgent needs of the masses. They needed jobs and a dignified life. The Nazis exploited the masses' desire for justice and equity. Hitler promised a classless society based on race with justice, equity, and exclusion of problematic populations. To hell with exploitation, and to hell with executive greed. Hitler's speeches were meticulously designed to elicit the most emotional reactions out of crowds. He rarely, if ever, included his actual goals in these speeches. The idea was to deceive as many people as possible. Hitler was so secretive about his true objectives that even members of his closest circle would often be confused about what he really wanted. The elusive and difficult to understand objectives of fascism is precisely what makes it so powerful. Fascism was all things to all people. If you were pro-capitalism, fascism promised to destroy the working class and take away all their bargaining power. If you were anti-capitalist, fascism would destroy the industrialists and raise the workers to their rightful place. Everyone heard exactly what they wanted to hear, which obscured all the red flags. Even the capitalists themselves weren't entirely sure whether the fascists were for them or against them. Those businessmen who attempted to assess the suddenly formidable new movement encountered a baffling riddle. The closer they scrutinized the NSDAP, the more difficult it became to determine whether it supported or opposed capitalism, and, more specifically, the large-scale organized enterprise to which capitalism had given rise in Germany. That riddle was not a chance occurrence. Hitler wanted things just this way. By cultivating a strategy of calculated ambiguity on economic matters, he sought to enable the appeals of his party to transcend the deep-seated social divisions in the country. One fact that confuses many people and leads some to claim that the Nazis must have been socialists is that during the years leading up to 1933, the Nazis formed a left-wing division for the exact same reason they included the word socialist in their party name, to trick would-be communist voters. The left-wing division, headed by Otto and Gregor Strasser, still held fundamentally racist beliefs but differed from the rest of the Nazi party in that they actively called for the nationalization or state ownership of private property, because this would have commanded nationwide attention and aroused extremely strong feelings. He wanted to avoid alienating any potential voters at all costs. He allowed the Nazi left-wing to talk about expropriating the German princes until they choked for the purposes of drawing in a wide voter base, but he never allowed real change to pass through. Anytime a proposition to abolish private property was put before him, Hitler would assure them that he would address it at a later time. He said the same thing about the next dozen times such propositions were put before him. During the early period of the Nazi Party in the early 1920s, some Nazi Party members had proposed some radical solutions, such as profit sharing between workers and capitalists or control of production by the workers. But they were quickly abandoned by Hitler or other Nazi leaders, who thought it was wise not to oppose industrialists and who also thought that they needed industrialists' support to gain power and carry out rearmament plans. Otto Strasser spent many long evenings begging Hitler to see reason, but despite all his rage, he was still just a rat in a cage. He would recount his frustration in his book Hitler and I. Then I laid before him the points of the Strasser program, as it had been drawn up at Hanover, and our ideas on the nationalization of industry. "It's Marxism," cried Hitler. "In fact, it's Bolshevism. Democracy has laid the world in ruins, and nevertheless, you want to extend it to the economic sphere? It would be the end of the German economy. You would wipe out all human progress which has only been achieved by the individual efforts of great scholars and great investors." In fact, Hitler was so afraid to offend industrialists that he arranged the murder of Otto and Gregor Strasser along with their sympathizers on the night of the Long Knife. Gregor was successfully assassinated while Otto managed to escape. Did the Nazis end up living up to that socialist ideal in their name? Not even close. Let's examine how Nazi actions differed from their political theater. Many people know that the Nazis targeted Jews, but fewer know that the leftists were the very first victims of the Nazi regime. Upon the Nazis gaining power, people were immediately separated based on values. Those who valued reason, social reform, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and class consciousness were summarily tortured, enslaved, and executed. The infamous book burnings began with a destruction of leftist literature. Ayn Rand would have been spared, unfortunately. Those not spared included radical works by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and just about any literature in favor of peace and equality, such as Erich Remarque's masterpiece, All Quiet on the Western Front. Mein Kampf was spared, obviously. I wonder why. For all their hatred of Jews, Nazis hated leftists more. In fact, leftists were the first to be sent to concentration camps and either executed or enslaved by the least cool gangsters of all time. In 1933 alone, more than 11,000 Germans were sent away to Dachau for the crime of being a socialist or a union leader. Socialists are well known for terrorizing the working class with violence and helping capitalists line their pockets. Wait, no, the Nazis did that. How did the working class fare under Hitler, who according to Prager would have been madly in love with Marx at the time? For Hitler, any talk about workers' rights was Marxism, which he despised for its promotion of democracy and equality. What happens to unions, an important weapon the working class uses against their capitalist exploiters once Hitler gained power, may be unsurprising. May 2nd, 1933 marked the beginning of union destruction. Just one day after the May Day or International Workers' Day, a day dedicated to the struggles and sacrifices the working class went through to secure rights like the 8-hour workday and the weekend, the Nazis shamelessly stormed union offices, arrested leaders and members, confiscated funds, and outlawed creating any new worker-led unions. Traditional unions were replaced with the Nazi German Labor Front, or the DAF. Membership was mandatory, and wages were deducted from every worker's paycheck with or without their consent. False hope was given to workers that conditions were improving by implementing purely aesthetic improvements such as flowers, lawn care, tiny rest areas, and enlarged windows. Wow. Workers were not allowed to bargain their wages or working conditions, the things that really mattered. These decisions were reserved for board members of the DAF, which were appointed by the Nazi Party, of course. Those appointed by the Nazis were ensured to be anti-Marxist and sympathetic to capitalism. The DAF was essentially an elementary school-style tattletale booth. Employees could come, cry their feelings out, and leave without getting a cent more in wages. Laws were passed which made it illegal for workers to quit their jobs whenever they saw fit. This emboldened managers so much that some believed themselves to be invincible and literally beat workers who were too slow. If workers were absent for more than 5 days, it was permissible to sentence them to prison for up to 9 years. If they caused too much trouble, they could always be forcibly relocated to a different company or simply thrown into a concentration camp for labor re-education. Mandatory minimum benefits such as illness and accident pay, retirement contributions, and employers' insurance were evaporated before people's eyes as a reminder that all their sacrifices were for nothing. Workers were expected to not only quit complaining, but be grateful for these assaults on their livelihoods. Industrialists like Krupp would be quoted saying, "We only want workers who are grateful from the bottom of their hearts for the bread which we let them earn." Robert Ley, a professional drunk and the man appointed by Hitler to command the DAF, made it very clear who they represented by promising to restore absolute leadership to the natural leader of the factory, that is, the employer. Only the employer can decide. And so, every decision the union made was subject to the whims of the capitalist class. Instead of being a weapon the working class could use to gain a better quality of living, unions were defanged and placed onto a theater stage to act out their suffering into the void. This loss of agency resulted in deflated wages. Real wages decreased by up to 40% for most workers aside from those employed in the war industry. Average weekly hours increased from 60 to over 72. If workers so much as dared to even whisper about taking back control of the unions, they were subject to jail time or being blacklisted from working in an entire industry. If the carrot did not work, the stick certainly did. Owners were regularly documented to have hired fascist brown shirt gangs to beat workers into submission. Does anyone remember the United Auto Workers strike back in 2023? Imagine Dark Brandon had hired the Crips to beat up the UAW protesters. In Nazi Germany, instead of blue, fascist gangs wore brown, no doubt to express the origins of their ideology, a puckering butthole. The bodyguards of capitalism. This is exactly how Hitler got his start. The gang he joined was called the German Workers' Party, later known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler was such a progressive socialist that he lapped Marx, and instead of fighting for workers' rights, he used his rights and his lefts to fight unionizers. Hitler was no friend of the working class. This extremely antagonistic relation would not have lasted as long as it did if it were not for the distractions the Nazis imposed upon workers. A program called Strength Through Joy was the bread and circuses the Nazi regime promoted to keep workers sedated with pleasure. We have something similar in America in the form of Monday Night Football, yet another Marvel movie, and fast food. Sometimes, hypnotic pleasure is more effective than the pain of discipline to curb worker resistance to exploitation. The Nazis promoted many of the same analgesics America uses to this day to pacify us. The activities that were promoted in Strength Through Joy included evening classes, theater trips, picnics, a broad range of mass participation sporting events, and very cheap or free holidays. There were walking holidays in Switzerland and skiing holidays in Bavaria. 2 big cruise liners were built to sail people around the Canary Islands for only 2 weeks' wages. Workers could even enter into a raffle to win a highly coveted Volkswagen Beetle. Did the Nazi Party just love and appreciate workers so much, or was there a hidden motive behind all these enjoyable activities? Strength Through Joy was established because it was necessary to control not only the working hours but the leisure hours of the individual. Bread and circuses sap just enough time and energy to prevent workers from planning escape routes. Also, these controlled leisurely activities ensured increased devotion to the Nazi Party, which was seen as the caring hand opposed to the fists of business. So, while workers suffered greatly, the rich just got richer. Membership fees stolen from the workers proved to be very profitable, sometimes bringing in as much as 160 million Reichsmarks a year. Robert Ley bought a whole series of grand villas in the most fashionable districts of Germany's towns and cities. The running costs, which in his villa in Berlin's Grunewald included a cook, 2 nannies, a chambermaid, a gardener, and a housekeeper. So, workers didn't do so well economically under the Nazis. But who did? First, we need to see how the Nazis rose to power in the first place. Surely, Hitler and his ferrets had some help in their rise to power, and the best form of help is money. Corporations initially distrusted the Nazis. They weren't too keen on all the anti-Semitism, and the Nazis' personalities weren't all too agreeable. As David Jong recounted in his book, Nazi Billionaires, initially, most business tycoons viewed Hitler and his Nazis as loud, violent, boorish, brutish, uniformed curiosities from the uneducated and impoverished hinterlands. Just some outlandish figures to joke about. In their earliest days, the Nazis were as much of a joke as Nick Fuentes is now. Capitalists were especially put off by the Nazi socialist rhetoric. The 25-point program, which was a list of 25 goals the Nazis aimed to accomplish, contained socialistic language which instilled fear into capitalists. Particularly points 11, the abolition of incomes unearned by work; 13, we demand the nationalization of all businesses which have formed into corporations; 14, we demand profit sharing in large industrial enterprises; and 17, we demand a land reform suitable to our national requirements, the passing of a law for the expropriation of land for communal purposes without compensation, the abolition of ground rent, and prohibition of all speculation in land. The 25-point program was written by Gottfried Feder, a member of the Nazi left-wing party. Yes, there were many Nazis who believed both in expropriating private property and gassing Jews. The specific points that I listed sound awfully socialistic. One could presume that Marx himself wrote them. Capitalists believed that the Nazis were sympathetic to Marxism, a cardinal sin. One angry industrialist yelled at a Nazi spokesman who was trying to obtain funds that he could not comprehend how anyone could support the Nazis when, along with a great deal of other nonsense in its 25-point program, demands the nationalization of all incorporated business enterprises. We have no reason to support our own gravediggers. Hitler, who was afraid to lose potential economic support, explained himself in front of his masters. Regarding the false interpretations of point 17, the one that called for nationalizing all private property, of the program of the NS-DAP on the part of our opponents, the following definition is necessary. Since the NS-DAP stands on the platform of private ownership, it happens that the passage gratuitous expropriation concerns only the creation of legal opportunities to expropriate, if necessary, land which has been illegally acquired or is not administered from the viewpoint of national welfare. This is an important asterisk to take into account. Hitler's forked tongue was getting him in trouble. He used socialistic language to lure in would-be communist voters while at the same time assuring his capitalist masters that he did not actually intend to follow through on his promises. He made sure to clarify that he only intended to take private property rights away from Jewish capitalists alone. This would create the perception that he followed through on the promises of the 25-point program, but at the same time left German capitalists alone. Unfortunately, Hitler's attempts to calm the fears of his capitalist supporters were unsuccessful. Before 1929, due to their socialistic language which scared off monetary support, the Nazi Party barely received 720,000 votes. There was no need to worry about their unpopularity, however, as all they needed was to wait for the right opportunity to strike. And that opportunity came like Christmas with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. Economic downturns result in radical, fringe movements suddenly rising to the forefront of politics. Prior to the Great Depression, the Nazis were never able to breach more than 2.6% of the vote. However, once the Great Depression grabbed the capitalists by the balls, they yelled uncle. A sudden tidal wave of support for the Communist Party crashed throughout Germany, and capitalists began to drown. The spirit of Marie Antoinette terrorized every owner. Standards of living dropped, unemployment consistently hovered around 7 million, and the middle class was disappearing. A revolution was coming, a German one. The relatively recent success of the Russian Revolution gave people a sense of hope and determination. Panic set in every capitalist's stone heart as they watched the polls with horror. Despite viewing the Nazis like a Californian liberal would a Trumper from Florida, capitalists soon realized the value of a party that was unopposed to using extreme violence against the working class and had a rabid hatred for communism. Monetary support, the best kind of help, trickled in slowly at first. The largest firms, the ones that had the most to lose in a German revolution, especially industries from iron, steel, mining, and banking, were the first to donate directly to Hitler's National Socialist Workers' Party. The amounts weren't large and served merely as an insurance premium. The chances of the Nazis defeating the communist parties was exceedingly small, but because they demonstrated such a passionate hatred for communism, capitalists thought it wouldn't hurt to keep Hitler and his ghouls around. Corporate donations were much larger for the liberal parties, which they preferred. Before the onset of the Great Depression and widespread desperation, the Nazi Party was only able to attract the loyalty of one big business owner, Fritz Thyssen. In 1923, the earliest days of the Nazi Party, Thyssen would regularly visit social gatherings in pub basements where young Nazis could prove their skills and contribute to the cause. Hitler was one of the people who had something to prove. Thyssen was starstruck by a young Hitler's oratory skills. Admittedly, Hitler was a great speaker who was able to tug at heartstrings and masterfully manipulate emotions. Thyssen was especially attracted by Hitler's anti-communist rants. He was one of the first to give economic support to Hitler's party with a donation of 100,000 Reichsmarks. Later, he ended up donating over 1 million Reichsmarks. He was the one who ultimately convinced President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, and also persuaded the Association of German Industrialists to give over 3 million Reichsmarks to the party in 1933. Hitler wasn't satisfied with the money he had received. Like every good capitalist, he just wanted more. And more he got. Hitler took advantage of the economic pressure cooker of the Great Depression and shrewdly played both sides to gain as many votes as possible. He fanned flames and spread panic by constantly reminding industrialists of the growing communist threat, while simultaneously passionately sermonizing the working class about the ever-growing greed and destructive appetites of the capitalists. Hitler finally achieved his goal of appeasing both sides. As liberal parties sat on the sidelines with their jaws lying somewhere below their belly buttons, the Nazis received 6 million votes in the 1930 general election. Capitalists tossed their liberal play toys aside, and in a desperate gasp for air from their economically induced panic attack, Mr. Bossman filled Nazi pockets to the brim with bacon, Benjis, bread, bucks, cabbage, cake, ka-ching, cheddar, and of course, dead presidents. Just to name a few, the mining industry donated 600,000 Reichsmarks. IG Farben, the largest chemical producer in Germany at the time, donated 400,000 Reichsmarks. The coal, iron, and engineering industries collectively contributed over 3 million Reichsmarks. The Nazis ended up receiving 38.4% of the vote, a gigantic leap. Winston Churchill once said, "Beware of driving men to desperation. Even a cornered rat is dangerous." Later into the 1930s, fully 50% of the Berlin Stock Exchange either donated to the Nazi Party, lined Hitler's pockets directly, and/or advised the party on best economic policies. 1 out of 7 companies, big and small, in the entire country had some sort of tie with the party. Why? Capitalist interests will do anything to destroy communism. It wasn't just big business owners who propelled the Nazi Party into power. Some will acknowledge that big business is harmful to the economy, but regard small business to be automatically moral based on nothing but its size relative to other businesses. Small business is still capitalist, and therefore has many of the same interests to pursue as big business. And so, it's unsurprising that small business owners showed up faithfully at the box office for Daddy Hitler. Caught between unassailable competition with big business on one side and the scary Marxists who wanted to steal their toothbrushes and underwear on the other, they voted for the Nazis, hoping that they could curb the power of big business and simultaneously stop the spread of communism. There were other indirect ways capitalists supported the Nazi Party. Corporations lent much-needed economic advice to the Nazis. Hitler found economics to be boring and left the economic planning to advisory boards staffed by captains of industry. Multiple heads of the largest industries in Germany supplied Hitler with access to the most effective means of propaganda, news media. Hitler was often invited by big business owners to exclusive gatherings which gave him an aura of credibility and trustworthiness. Another indirect way of supporting the Nazis was simply keeping silent. What the industrialists did was just as important as what they failed to do. Henry Turner suggests in German Big Business that capitalists didn't speak out about the Nazis' plans to smash the working class and those they deemed inferior because they, quote, failed to perceive the threat it posed to the very foundations of civilized life. I disagree with this. Big business knew exactly why they were lining the pockets of the Nazis. Brown shirts, otherwise known as the SA or Assault Division of the Nazi Party, had been attacking unions and killing socialists since 1921, well before capitalists cozied up to the party. Big business was investing in a domestic and international army to bludgeon the working class into submission and steal every last cent out of honest people's pockets. It is now 1933. Hitler is in power and he knows exactly who to thank and how. Private property is arguably the most important feature of capitalism, and what the Nazis did with private property rights when they came to power reveals who they really supported. If it was the socialists they supported, did they nationalize private property? Did they grant democratic rights to workers? First, let's quickly summarize how private property came to be and why it is so central to our argument. Prior to the rise of capitalism around 400 years ago, land and the fruits it would bear was open for use by anyone in the surrounding community. Nobody could claim exclusive rights to any any land and exclude others from using it. In England, for example, members of the community might have grazing rights or the right to collect firewood. Harvest could also be collected by those who so desired. Limits were placed on how much an individual could accumulate. Land was used for the benefit of entire communities instead of shrewd individuals. You simply did not have to own something to use it. This ancient way of living was fundamentally destroyed with the rise of capitalism in the 16th century. To collect as much profit as possible from the land, capitalists had to devise a way to exclude all others from using it. Barbed wire came in handy for keeping profits in and community out. Lands that belonged to peasants were stolen en masse with extreme violence. Landlords converted common lands into profitable ventures such as sheep farming. As Marx once said, the birth of capitalism comes dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. It is impossible for capitalism to exist without first destroying communal property and violently removing people off the land they have cultivated for hundreds of years. The destruction of common lands was the single factor most responsible for the growing plague of vagabonds, those dispossessed, masterless men who wandered the countryside and threatened social order, or what we today call homelessness. Violently stealing land was not enough. The core idea of holding land in common had to be eliminated as well. This was done through the concept of improvement. Racist colonialists justified their violence by asserting that the mighty Europeans would use land much more productively than the backwards and primitive natives. They could improve the land beyond what these natives would ever be capable of. The quote-unquote failure of natives to produce an economy based on profit gave colonialists ammunition to dehumanize and steal their land. Of course, only savages would be stupid enough to use land to benefit the entire community instead of using it for selfish gain. As we will see later in the video, this is the exact justification the Nazis used to wage their imperialistic war. According to the Communist Manifesto, the theory of the communist may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. If Hitler really was a socialist, like some right-wingers and despicable liberals claim, he must have regarded private property negatively and wanted to forcibly take it away from the capitalists that owned it, right? In the early days of the Nazi Party, when they wrote up their future goals in the 25-point program, many passages in it used socialistic language and included passages denouncing banks, department stores, and interest slavery. What's interesting about these specific complaints is that they are indistinguishable from plain anti-Semitism. Jewish capitalists alone were blamed for causing economic decline by owning too many banks and issuing predatory loans. The German capitalists who did the exact same thing were never mentioned, for a very good reason. The Nazis never had the intention of taking away all private property, but merely wanted to remove Jews from the competitive pool and give a leg up to the quote-unquote master race. Immediately upon taking power in 1933, the Nazis began a campaign of mass expropriation of private property that may have made Lenin proud. However, the devil is always in the details. Private property rights were only taken away from Jewish owners. Aside from the Nazis' surface-level socialistic language, if one digs deeper into the nuance, you realize that the Nazis never intended to abolish the institution of private property in its entirety, as Marx had directed. The goal was to take away property specifically from Jewish capitalists and make it seem as though they were following through with their promises. In reality, Jewish property was not converted into state property, as one might expect a socialist government to do, but simply given away for cheap or even free to Germans. A bizarre article published on iHeartRadio.com makes the claim that the fact that Jewish property was at the top of the list of who to target doesn't make it less Marxist or socialist to do. Who you're targeting for confiscation schemes should be a moot point, except who you target and what you do with that property after is anything but a moot point. It's the beating heart of the issue. The amendment to point 17 of the Nazi Party's platform, which called for nationalization of private property, explicitly states that only property illegally acquired would be taken away. Can anyone guess what it was that classified property as illegally acquired? If it was owned by Jews, of course. To justify taking away the private property of Jewish owners, the Nazis accused them, and only them, of excess profits and extortion. No Aryan capitalists were ever accused of doing the same, even though they were just as guilty, as we will soon see. And so, the only property that was expropriated by the Nazi state was Jewish-owned. But even this was not in any way socialistic, as the iHeart article claimed. Property that was taken away from Jewish owners was not nationalized, but simply sold or even sometimes given for free to an Aryan. So, by taking away private property rights from Jews, they were able to accomplish two important goals: appear socialistic to attract more working class votes, and give Aryan capitalists an advantage in the market by eliminating some competition. If capitalists ever believed the Nazis were actually socialists, they would have overthrown them decisively, just like America overthrew the socialist governments of Russia, Korea, Syria, Guatemala, Iran, East Timor, Afghanistan, Panama, Haiti, and on 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 and on. Hitler actually had a lot of respect for private property as long as it was owned and operated by a German. Although Hitler did publicly call for the nationalization of all private property, behind closed doors he did everything he could to convince his capitalist sponsors that he had the utmost conviction in upholding private property. His conception of private property can best be illustrated by recounting a conversation Hitler had in secret with a leader of the Nazi left-wing division, Otto Strasser, who he later would try to murder. Otto actually wanted to nationalize private property while Hitler merely pretended to want the same. Otto would say to Hitler, "In my eyes, property is not inalienable. We desire a German socialism and thus participation in all ownership, direction, and profits of the German economy." Adding to this, he would say, "We naturally know that all culture rests on ownership, but recognize the extraordinary importance of this ascertainment, namely that the material foundation allows the human being to flourish and have a proud and proper bearing. Thus, the necessity of giving the non-property owning 80% of Germans the possibility of acquiring a form of property. Today's capitalist system doesn't give them this possibility. If this nation is to achieve freedom and honor, it will be necessary to give the oppressed sections of this nation property and the right of co-determination." Hard to believe I agree with a Nazi on something. Hitler, upon hearing this, rejected Otto's proposal to nationalize private property. What you call socialism is purely Marxist vision. The employer is responsible for production and assures the workers their subsistence. Our great heads of industry are not concerned with the accumulation of wealth and the good life. Rather, they are concerned with responsibility and power. They have acquired this right by natural selection. They are members of the higher race. But you would surround them with a council of incompetents who have no notion of anything. Essentially, Hitler believed capitalists deserved to exploit labor and keep profits to themselves because they were genetically superior. Handing over the means of production to genetically inferior workers would cause chaos. It would be like expecting a monkey to know how to fly a plane. Private property was kept around because the Nazis believed it was the most efficient system due to the natural competition it produced. Since all companies were locked in a perpetual struggle against one another, there would be a natural tendency to continuously improve methods of production. This would result in an exponentially increased efficiency over time. Otto would ask Hitler what he planned to do with the private property of large corporations like Krupp steel mill. If you seized power in Germany tomorrow, what would you immediately do with the Krupp firm? Regarding the shareholders, the workers, the property, the benefits, and the direction, would you keep things as they are? Hitler replied matter-of-factly, "Of course. Do you think I'm stupid enough to destroy the economy? The state will only intervene if people do not act in the interest of the nation. There is no need for dispossession or participation in all the decisions. The state will only intervene when it must." With the power of foreshadowing, I will mention that the Nazi state never ended up having to intervene on a large scale, as Daniel Guerin noted in Fascism and Big Business. If the Nazi government had wanted to divide among the workers the 2 billion or so of big business's increased profit, it would have placed itself in flagrant opposition to the economy. And he's correct. The Nazis had all the power in the world to take control of corporations and distribute profits among the workers, but this never happened. I wonder why. In fact, once the Nazis finally gained power, the exact opposite happened. The process known as privatization, which describes how a piece of property or business goes from being owned by the government to privately owned, began in full swing as a thank you to the capitalists who helped put Hitler in power. In fact, the word privatization is the English translation of the word Reprivatisierung, which was invented when the Nazis came to power. In return for their support, corporations were rewarded beyond their wildest dreams. Reprivatization, or relinquishing government control over corporations, began with the banks. Deutsche Bank was given back 20 million Reichsmarks in stock. Dresdner Bank bought back its stock in 1936. The Nazis returned stock to Deutscher Schiff- und Maschinenbau, a giant shipyard conglomerate. The steel industry received over 125 million Reichsmarks in stock back. Before the Nazis, the Weimar government controlled 52% of United Steel, but after 1933, 25% of the government's stock was sold off to private interests, which was no longer sufficient in German law to give the government any privileges in company control. These are only a few of the numerous other examples of the government relinquishing control of the economy to capitalists. As the cherry on top, big business was granted tax deductions amounting to 500 million Reichsmarks, and income tax was reduced by half. Now, what about all this is socialist, Dennis? Corporate interests were absolutely delighted to be back in control. Putting the Nazis in power was an awfully risky gamble, and to their surprise it had paid off. Private property remained untouched, and the infinite cycle of accumulation could continue, only this time without suffocating restrictions. A fond partnership formed between the economic titans and the Nazi Party. Quid pro quo was the name of the game. For a moment, we will pause and briefly consider what Hitler wanted to achieve now that he was in power. The German word Lebensraum means living space. More than anything, Hitler wanted to expand Germany and acquire more living space after it had been embarrassed in World War I and had large portions of its territories confiscated. To accomplish this, he was going to have to amass weaponry, and a lot of it, a process known as rearmament. But how was he going to assemble an army strong enough to conquer all of Europe, much less Soviet Russia, when the Nazi government had just sold off rights to all factories capable of producing weaponry into private hands? An especially annoying obstacle was the profit incentive that all corporations were subservient to. Useless commodities like today's Funko Pops were much more profitable to produce than expensive and labor-intensive weaponry. Corporations would try to resist Nazi pressure to switch production to rearmament as they only cared about short-term profits. For them, war was too great of a risk. To his credit, Hitler was more of a long-term thinker and was able to see what the short-term greed of the executives blocked them from seeing. War was essential if the capitalist system was to survive into the future. The Nazis had to quickly devise a plan to make sure corporations kept accumulating profits while at the same time incentivizing them to abandon commodity production in favor of rearmament. The state accomplished this in three ways. First, it restricted import and distribution of raw materials. According to Parker Apt, Germany was a net importer of raw materials. Therefore, the Nazis found it important to reallocate their scarce supply of raw materials through supervisory boards to help rearmament. This reallocation made it hard for companies to get the amount of raw materials necessary to fund their own projects. However, the Nazis would release more raw materials for projects deemed important for rearmament or reaching economic independence. Thus, it became profitable in many instances for companies to pursue the goals of the Reich. Only firms that were compliant in rearmament production got the greatest amount and best quality of materials. Firms that were obstinate and preferred to produce consumer products usually got last dibs. An example of how this rationing incentive system worked in the textile industry is recounted by Christopher Buchheim. From spring 1934 onwards, the purchase of raw materials was regulated in the textile industry. Later, quotas were established, which in principle restricted each firm the processing of materials to a certain percentage according to a reference period. In addition, beginning in 1936, enterprises were required to mix a minimum amount of artificial fibers with their inputs of natural raw materials. Within this rationing framework, however, firms generally remained free to produce those varieties of textiles they considered were most profitable to them. So, even if the Nazis made it inconvenient, corporations still had control over what they produced and how. Gigantic steel firms like Krupp's were not very interested in rearmament production, and thus chose to spend a measly 45 million Reichsmarks on weaponry, while spending almost double that amount on producing more profitable civilian goods. Second, the state made it very easy to profit from rearmament production. Even though consumer products made a greater amount of money, government contracts for rearmament production tagged on an extra 3 to 6% guaranteed profit. This was essentially free money for the capitalists because they could bypass advertising expenditures and sell to the state directly, which promised to buy an agreed upon amount. Finally, the Nazis always held the hammer of nationalization over the capitalists' heads. Even though they never followed through with it, the threat of nationalization alone was enough to keep a sufficient number of capitalists in line with rearmament goals. You might say, wait a minute, isn't it extremely socialist that the Nazis controlled what companies could produce? That sounds an awful lot like what Soviet Russia did. Well, socialism is not when the government does stuff. As we will see shortly, governments in all capitalist countries control the free market to some extent, even in America. Without certain restrictions, capitalist markets would fall apart entirely. Although the government controlled the distribution of raw materials and could dictate what companies produced, they offered many different contracts that companies could choose from and still profit. Products were guaranteed to be bought by the state at a guaranteed maximum price. This maximum price would always include a certain percentage of money that was purely profit. Production risks were often shifted onto the government. If any losses in profit were experienced during production, such as machines unexpectedly blowing up or raw materials depreciating, companies would be compensated in full with taxpayer money. Sometimes the state would take over production entirely, and all the owner had to do was sit in his backyard lawn chair, bathe in the sun, drink his piña colada, and wait for the profits to roll into his bank account. Is it really socialist for a government to temporarily take over a company but still pay the CEO a handsome bonus package every year? Other contracts would promise complete uninvolvement of the state in production as long as the company could aid the government in rearmament. As you can see, everything was done to make sure the capitalists continued to churn a profit. Christopher Buchheim pointed out that in contrast to a socialist economy of the Soviet type, rationing of inputs in the Third Reich was not accompanied by material balancing. That means the exact allocation of inputs with regard to specific output needs was generally not planned beforehand. Most enterprises could freely choose among a whole range of production possibilities, all of which had privileged access to ration materials, including the making of almost every finished product for export, because exports commanded a very high priority. In other words, the Nazi economy upheld the unplanned, anarchist production style of capitalism, but tried to steer it towards preparing for war by dangling the carrot of profit and threatening the stick of nationalization. The threat to nationalize never manifested itself. Like the Krupp steel mill, many companies refused to shift to rearmament and kept doing what they were doing. Buchheim gives a few examples. De Vendel, a coal mining enterprise, refused to build a hydrogenation plant. In spring 1939, IG Farben declined a request by the Economics Ministry to enlarge its production of rayon for use in tires. It also was not prepared to invest a substantial amount in a third Buna, or synthetic rubber factory, although this was a project of high urgency for the regime. In the second half of the 1930s, the demand for armament production was so high that exports of consumer goods threatened to be totally crowded out. Therefore, the company planned a capacity enlargement, but asked the Reich to share the risk by giving subsidized credit and permitting exceptional depreciation to reduce its tax load. When the latter demand was not accepted at first, the firm reacted by refusing to continue producing for war. In the end, the state fully surrendered to the requests of the firm. In summary, profit ultimately dictated whether or not firms would comply with Nazi orders. Still, even though the Nazis practically begged for maximum production for rearmament, capitalists kept the spirit of independence and dedicated a portion of their production capacities for consumerism. Executives were smart enough to realize that armament production would not continue forever and continue to satisfy their consumer base. The rare times the Nazis created their own nationalized companies were because there was no private interest in an unprofitable venture. An example is the Reichswerk Hermann Göring, a nationalized mining company run by the state, which was created because it was too unprofitable to extract iron ore. In other instances, when an economic activity was important to the government's interest but was too unprofitable, the Nazis would guarantee a certain profit margin, usually between 3 to 6% on top of covering all costs and losses. Often, if these ventures churn a profit on their own, control over the business is handed over completely to a capitalist. The Nazi state never wanted to run these companies and did everything they could to get them off their hands. Hitler wanted not to socialize German big business, but rather to conscript it. Maybe you still hold some doubt about the socialistic qualities of the Nazis. The Nazis' attempts to control the capitalist market seemed to be awfully socialistic. But during this time, Hitler's government was not the only one doing this. Franklin Roosevelt did the exact same thing in America, one of the least socialist countries in the world. As America made the decision to enter the war, the federal government began stressing the importance of preparedness, or getting ready for war by producing enough armaments. Just like in Germany, corporations were urged to switch their production from consumer goods to weaponry. This was of course bitterly resisted by corporations because it was much more profitable to make consumer goods, as it was in Germany. Corporations did not care about the health of the nation, only their bottom line. So the federal government was forced to create the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act, which authorized the president to take immediate possession of any plant or facility equipped for the manufacture, production, or mining of any articles or materials which may be required for the war effort, or which may be useful in connection therewith. In other words, it was now legal to take over and control any company that made the process of preparedness more difficult than it needed to be, just like in Germany. Montgomery Ward, a top retail company, was one example of more than 4 dozen times the Smith-Connolly Act was used. When a strike threatened to disrupt production, the government ordered then CEO Sowell L. Avery to concede to the demands of the workers. There was nothing more hated by Avery than workers' rights. In fact, he was so anti-labor that... Wait a minute. Oh. When Avery refused to comply with government demands, the National Guard was called in to remove the obstinate CEO, resulting in this iconic photo. Roosevelt made it very clear that the government was in charge during wartime when he announced to unions and executives alike, strikes in wartime cannot be condoned, whether they are striked by workers against their employers or strikes by employers against the government. Would you consider Roosevelt to be a socialist? Not only was production tightly controlled, but price restrictions were put in place as well. Roosevelt created the Office of Price Administration, which placed an upper limit of prices and restricted consumption through rationing. That's right, businesses were not legally allowed to raise prices during a wartime economy in America. Would you still accuse Roosevelt of being a socialist? I hope not, because not only was private property and profit preserved, but workers were pushed even further under the employer's heel when union strikes were outlawed. The point is that Nazi Germany's effort to control the capitalist market was in no way socialist. Later, we'll see exactly why capitalism wouldn't be able to survive without state regulation of the market. For now though, let's take a look at how German corporations took advantage of the horrors the Nazis ended up unleashing. Even though capitalist short-term interests were sometimes subordinated to the imperialist interests of the Nazi state, they did not have much to complain about as they were rewarded beyond their wildest dreams. Corporations were allowed to completely ignore morality as long as they pleased Hitler. Even the most heinous act in human history, the Holocaust, didn't seem to upset the stomachs of many corporate executives. Let's now take a look at how corporations were able to take advantage of the cruelty that the Nazis unleashed in the name of accumulation. The Associated Press, or AP, spread Nazi propaganda within the United States. All information was subject to approval or censorship from the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The motivations were of course economic in nature. In exchange for promising not to publish anything criticizing the Reich, the AP was the only American news agency permitted to stay open in Germany. Known as Auto Union back then, Audi enjoyed profiting off the slave labor of over 3,700 concentration camp inmates. Chase Bank assisted Nazi anti-Semitism spread throughout Europe. When the Nazis reached France, Chase Bank had no moral qualms with freezing Jewish accounts. Ford produced planes for the German military. Ford is a quintessentially American company, which is why it's so interesting that they were happy to supply the German army with planes, while at the same time refusing to produce any for Roosevelt and the American army. Henry Ford and Hitler were bedfellows and had mutual respect for each other. When Henry Ford tried to run for president in 1923, Hitler offered to send shock troops to Chicago to keep the peace. As late as 1938, Henry Ford was gifted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest civilian award in Nazi Germany. BMW helped design engines for fighter planes such as the Focke-Wulf FW-190 to outmaneuver the Allies' planes. Of course, these engines were manufactured with the generous help of more than 16,600 concentration camp slaves in Buchenwald and Dachau. There were thousands more held in BMW plants all across the country. IBM helped the Nazis keep demographic information about unwanted populations with punch cards. The cards gave the Nazis the ability to categorize and keep track of their enemies. The disabled were labeled with the number 2, the communists with 6, and the Jews with 8. IG Farben was a particularly evil company. They were the chemical producer that made Zyklon B, which killed millions of people. Inmates at Auschwitz were forced to build the chemical facilities that would eventually be used to kill them and their families. IG Farben executives had no issues with the SS beating inmates to discipline them, although they preferred for the abuse to take place out of sight. Workers were encouraged to beat one another and keep each other in line. Robert Ley of the DAF, drunk as usual, when asked what to do with uncooperative workers, said, "When a Russian pig has to be beaten, it would be the ordinary German worker who would have to do it. You won't be doing it, and I won't." Food was used as a disciplinary measure as well. Hermann Göring once proposed to feed inmates with horse and cat meat, but it was sadly reported that there were not enough cats to feed workers doing hard physical labor, and horse meat was already being rationed to the German population. Whatever little food was available was distributed based on productivity. Average workers received average rations. Those who underperformed were forced to give up a portion of their food to those who were most productive. There was never enough food to feed all the workers adequately. This was on purpose to promote vicious competition and save money. As you can see, in a capitalist society, most everything is driven by the logic of profit or loss. Natural differences in strength and ability were exploited to make sure no calories were wasted. The most profitable workers would receive the most calories, and the least efficient workers would be left to waste away. Despite an inmate's productivity being as much as 40% less efficient than a normal worker's, and despite having to pay off the SS and replace workers often due to malnutrition and neglect, corporations still found slave labor to be more profitable than hiring a worker who was owed full human rights. Due to the Nazis' war efforts, employers enjoyed a consistent flow of forced labor. As Germany expanded into eastern territories, fresh labor was constantly arriving to replace the living skeletons who could no longer pick themselves up off the floor. By 1944, the concentration camp system held 500,000 inmates, with half of them contracted out to private firms. And what a waste. Most corporations didn't even believe in Nazi ideology. Sure, there were many who were anti-Semitic and thought highly of Hitler, but a great majority simply saw cold, hard cash and opportunistically took advantage of a profitable labor supply. To them, it didn't matter where the labor came from and how it was treated. Concentration camps and the suffering that took place inside of them didn't seem to strike much feeling in the dead hearts of executives. To those sympathetic to capitalism, it is easy to say that industrial complicity with the Holocaust was a one-time historical mistake and certainly would not be repeated again. However, the FASPE, or the Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics, stated that corporate complicity with the most unjust political regime in history was simply business as usual. What these corporations did was technically legal in German law, and some executives genuinely believed what they were doing was helping German society. Who can seriously claim that something like the Holocaust couldn't possibly happen again? Only someone like this guy could. Our modern times may be technologically advanced, but we have made no progress in our fundamental social relationships with one another. There is still exploitation. There is still injustice. There is still inequality. There is still capitalism. Later, when these companies were sued for using slave labor, their lawyers tried to portray the plaintiffs as greedy opportunists who just wanted to take advantage of Holocaust survivors for a check. How ironic. The executives considered the compensation to be a generous gesture of goodwill on their part and proudly patted themselves on the back. By 2007, 5 billion euros were paid out to victims' families based on the number of hours stolen. This was only done to avoid much larger, financially devastating civil lawsuits, not because anyone felt remorse. As punishment for crimes that even the devil himself would find repulsive, executives from the largest beneficiaries of concentration camp labor received at most only 1.5 to 8 years in prison. To put just how unjust that is into perspective, in 2016, a man in Louisiana was facing 20 years to life for the unspeakable crime of stealing $30 worth of candy from a Dollar General. Most of the companies themselves were allowed to continue doing business without restriction or consequences. BMW still exists, Allianz still exists, Ford still exists, Chase Bank still exists, IBM still exists. Why stop here though? There are even more ways that the Nazis and capitalists circle-jerked each other. Capitalism doesn't favor the weak, including their own. Money flows upwards, meaning small businesses get decimated one after another while large businesses continue to slurp up market share. During the war effort, many small businesses were temporarily shut down so their workers would be free to work for a massive firm involved in rearmament. The principle of efficiency favored the great monopolies and combines, the plants with the most powerful technical equipment, and demanded the exclusion from the productive processes of all those who could not keep pace with the giants. During this time, small business owners made no profit. Sometimes the Nazis would even prevent entire new industries from forming, all to keep competition away from the big guys. Large businesses quite literally became veritable gods with the help of the Nazis. This is Disney's and Apple's and Amazon's wet dream. A world devoid of competition. 100% of the market is theirs, and the dream of infinite money has materialized. Thank you, Nazis! Now to all those crying socialism, those small businesses that were sacrificed to the war effort were fully restored after the war had ended. Owners were compensated for lost profits as well. If Hitler was such a socialist, who gained and who lost the most under him? Socialists and communists surely weren't winning when they were getting tortured, imprisoned, and killed. During the 1930s, the height of Nazi rule, most of the West wasn't experiencing much economic growth at all. At most, the top percentile of earners lost a little less than everyone else did. But in Germany, the same top percentile of earners, I'm talking the top 5%, were swimming in money as their share of the national income exceeded a 15% gain. Companies that remained loyal to the Nazis enjoyed returns that were 5 to 8% higher than their unconnected competition. Loyalists' share prices rose by 7.2% in 1933. Companies that decided to go against the grain only grew by a pathetic 0.2%. So what exactly was the Nazi economy? Was it capitalist? Was it socialist? Or maybe was it something in between? Unsurprisingly, it is extremely difficult to define what exactly the Nazi economy was. It takes convenient elements from two contradictory systems. Capitalism and socialism are fundamentally opposed, but miraculously, the Nazis managed to combine elements of the two. There are elements of capitalism, elements of socialism, but the Nazi economy can't be defined by either. It would be more fitting to say that the Nazis were enamored by capitalism, but begrudgingly had to implement some socialist elements to achieve their goal of world domination. Weird, right? If you're confused right now, you're far from alone. Otto Nathan wrote a great summary of this whole mess. Nazism erected a system of production, distribution, and consumption that defies classification in any of the usual categories. It was not capitalism in the traditional sense. The autonomous market mechanism so characteristic of capitalism during the last 2 centuries had all but disappeared. It was not state capitalism. The government disclaimed any desire to own the means of production, and in fact took steps to denationalize them. It was not socialism or communism either. Private property and private profit still existed. The Nazi system was rather a combination of some of the characteristics of capitalism and a highly planned economy. Without in any way destroying its class character, a comprehensive planning mechanism was imposed on an economy in which the distribution of national income remained fundamentally unchanged, and in which private entrepreneurs retained their prerogatives and responsibilities in traditional capitalism. So now we know Nazi Germany supported the capitalist system inside its borders. But capitalism is a global system. Did Hitler walk side by side with capitalism in their quest to conquer the entire world? To answer this question, first, let's talk about an unlikely ally the Nazis made to help them kickstart World War II. Some might object to everything I've just said. If the Nazis weren't socialists, why did they collaborate with Soviet Russia to kick off World War II? It is a fact that Hitler despised Soviet Russia and everything it stood for. He once said that the Soviet Union was the greatest danger for the culture and civilization of mankind which has ever threatened it since the collapse of the ancient world. Dramatic much? We must remember ideological concerns are always subordinated to economic concerns. Both Germany and Soviet Russia stood to gain massive economic benefits from collaborating to capture Poland. Hitler knew that he would not be able to expand into Poland unopposed with Russia as an enemy. He was sober enough from meth not to poke the bear yet. XP had to be gained first. And yes, the Nazis did a lot of meth to stay awake for long periods of time. Stalin wasn't interested in fighting Germany until his military was developed and Russian people were starving. It was an economically desperate time, and so a non-aggression deal was signed in 1939 called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act. The eastern half of Poland was to go to Russia along with Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Hitler was to get the rest. Hakim made a great video about this that you should check out if you want a deeper understanding. I linked it in the description below. The largest German corporations, with the help of the Nazis, spent the years between 1933 and 1939 filling out their frames as they gobbled up most of the domestic market. Disaster was imminent. Without continuous profits, the capitalist system can't function. Why? If there is no profit to be made, an investment will not be made either. Without investment, nobody gets paid. If nobody gets paid, well, you get the picture. What is the solution to this intolerable situation? Get bigger. That is the solution to most problems in capitalism. To survive, German industry would have to expand into foreign lands and begin feeding on their markets. Immediately, however, there is a problem. No CEO would individually offer up their assets to fund the war necessary to conquer new territory. Hitler was the hero they needed, and luckily for them, he had come prepared. After having successfully manipulated companies into complying with rearmament production needs, Hitler was ready to go on the offensive. It was time to conquer Europe in the name of Germany, but actually in the name of German corporations. In some real sense, World War II was not a war between nations, but a war between capitalist giants competing on a world stage for dominance. Hitler was not the cause of World War II. The limitless appetite of capitalist competition was. This makes Hitler and the Nazis merely a vehicle for creating a war machine capable of taking on the power of multiple nations. Lenin said, "The imperialist epoch is characterized by the tendency towards the stagnation and decay of capitalism. Not only are the imperialistic powers parasitic, living off the tribute which pours in from the rest of the world, but their economies are retarded, held back from full development by the growing contradiction between the socialization of production and the private relations of property." Hitler was a chariot that German corporations rode into battle. He fulfilled a historical role that was necessary at the time. If not Hitler, maybe Gunther would have stepped up to the task. In fact, he might have been worse than Hitler. International aggression is something common to all capitalist economies. The rise of finance capital creates a new requirement for investment, the need to export capital. This is because advanced capitalist societies can become overripe. Few opportunities for profitable investment remain at home, yet elsewhere, capital is scarce, the price of land is relatively low, wages are low, raw materials are cheap. Such backward countries are prime for investment. Hitler's desire to conquer living space for the Aryan race conveniently coincided with the capitalist's need to constantly expand and accumulate. If we wish to save Germany, we must see to it that our farmers remain faithful to the land. To do so, they must have room to breathe and room to work. We must retain our colonies and we must expand eastward. As Henry Turner said in German Big Business, even though he derided the economy as unimportant, he knew that in order to keep increasing the German population, he would need more living space. This birthed the idea idea to conquer other territories, especially Eastern Europe. Believe it or not, fascism does not necessarily lead to war. As Daniel Guerin observed in Fascism and Big Business, capitalism means war. Throughout history, there were many liberal governments that engaged in countless wars. The United States is not explicitly fascist, yet this has not stopped it from waging forever wars. It would take Obama, the poster child of liberal professionalism, 3 entire years to apologize for every drone strike death he greenlit in the service of oil giants. Fascism is war, coming to power against the will and interests of its own countrymen. Fascism seeks a way out of its growing domestic difficulties in aggression against other countries and peoples, in their redivision of the globe by unleashing a world war. Fascism is a tool that is used by the ruling classes to continue expansion when democratic procedure doesn't provide enough blood money. As soon as a whiff of true democracy is detected, fascist gangs are employed to smash it. But the world need not be like this. As long as people realize what is keeping peace chained up in a moldy basement, we have a chance of freeing it. Peace can only be accomplished if the economy is limited to need, rather than dedicated to endless suicidal accumulation. Mao reminds us, when human society advances to the point where classes and states are eliminated, there will be no more wars, counter-revolutionary or revolutionary, unjust or just. That will be the era of perpetual peace for mankind. Peace is antithetical to capitalism. Peace can't coexist with multinational cutthroat competition. The preservation of international peace renders it possible for the enslaved masses in the fascist countries to gather their forces together and to prepare for the overthrow of the hated fascist dictatorship, and to enable the international proletariat to win time for the establishment of unity of its ranks, to rally together the supporters of peace, and to establish the insurmountable barrier against the outbreak of war. And fascism provides a powerful justification for the destruction of peace, which keeps the veins of profit flowing. War gives the masses a false sense of purpose. Instead of focusing their energy on the real war, which is between classes, the masses are mobilized to fight each other. Entire generations are wiped out for the benefit of the rich minority. Fascist movements hinder united actions by the states interested in the maintenance of peace, prevent unity of action by the international labor movement. For Hitler, peace was a Jewish invention and therefore suspect. Who could have prevented the World War? Not the so-called world pacifism. Again, an exclusively Jewish invention. The truth is, Hitler did genuinely desire peace. A piece of Poland, a piece of France, a piece of Austria, a piece of the Soviet Union, a piece of Luxembourg, a piece of Denmark, a piece of the Netherlands, a piece of Belgium, a piece of Greece, and of course a piece of Yugoslavia. The people who populated these conquered regions were considered to be an inferior race, not even human. It is much easier to exploit someone you believe to be beneath you than your equal. For Hitler, according to Marcuse, modern society is perpetuated by ruthless competition among unequal groups and individuals. Only the most ruthless and most efficient competitor can get along in this world. The first task of National Socialism is, therefore, to restore Germany's position as a powerful competitor on the international market. The Nazis were instrumental in spreading this racist ideology throughout the masses and manufacturing consent for imperial domination. Eastern territories were not only used for their resources but also to open new markets. As the German domestic market became overripe, the need for fresh markets to exploit manifested itself. The Nazis didn't only intend to conquer Eastern territories and appropriate their resources, but also colonize the land as well with Aryans. Marcuse reminded us in Technology, War, and Fascism that Hitler promised the capitalist continents as their exclusive markets, and the whole populations of conquered territories as compulsory and suppliers. The present rulers of Germany do not believe in ideologies and in the mysterious power of the race, but they will follow their leader as long as he remains what he has hitherto been, the living symbol of efficiency. Capitalists needed someone like Hitler on their side because he was willing to do anything necessary to expand Germany and siphon off new resources and slave labor. Race was essential for justifying the use of slave labor. The rest of Europe deserved to be conquered because the inferior races used their land, labor, and resources unproductively and wastefully. Aryans would make much better use of this land and rid the world of poisonous and inferior races. The same capital became something very different when it was employed productively on the one hand or exploitatively on the other. If they remained true to their heritage, Germans used capital productively to meet the needs of their fellow countrymen, not to register profits. Jews and other people deemed to be inferior, by contrast, always used capital exploitatively as a means to accumulate further wealth and transform it into power. Hundreds of thousands of Eastern Europeans were enslaved and put to work for the Nazi Empire. Ironically, for all their hatred of foreigners, Germany depended a whole lot on foreign labor to keep their economy running. By 1944, 20% of the entire German workforce was populated by non-Aryans. Germany would never have been able to conquer as much territory as it did without foreign slave labor. National Socialism was plagued by contradiction just as much as capitalism itself was. On the one hand, the Nazis couldn't survive without foreigners, and on the other hand, they were determined to exterminate them. They wasted millions of potential workers in their deadly concentration camps, but were constantly short of labor. Now let's talk about why the relationship between a state and capitalism is so important. In true dialectical fashion, just as capitalists can't survive without a state, the state can't survive without capitalists. Everyone knows that socialism is when the government does things, and communism is when the government does a lot of things, right? Many people still hold the erroneous belief that if the government intervenes in the market in any capacity, it must be socialist. In 2008, when the government bailed out the crumbling banks with $450 billion of taxpayer money, nobody seemed to accuse it of socialism. But when people don't want to have to choose between filing for bankruptcy or getting a life-saving surgery, a problem which could be solved with public health care, suddenly the accusation of socialism is invoked. The West believes in many myths: the American dream, the self-made man, Western superiority, and the separation of business and government. America especially is conceived as a place where cash flows freely without government interference. I'm here to break the hearts of free market ideologues. Capitalism simply couldn't exist without state management. Accusing the state of socialism is an attack used selectively by capitalists. When the government strengthens working-class bargaining power, this is a bad kind of socialism. When corporations beg Daddy Sam for money so they don't go out of business, this is in no way socialist. It's business as usual. In fact, socialism has nothing to do with state intervention in the market. Socialism is explicitly focused on private property relations. True socialism requires private property to be owned and managed by the workers themselves. What about when the state replaces capitalists as the owner and manager of corporations? Isn't this as socialist as it gets? As long as private property belongs to any entity other than the working class, it is not socialist. Yes, the government can be capitalist too. Accusing the Nazis of socialism just because they tried to tell some companies what to do is dishonest. Simply directing profits to the state instead of to an individual capitalist doesn't change the fundamental nature of the system. This is known as state capitalism and is similar to how the Nazi economy operated. The Nazis were accused of socialism because they often intervened in the economy. Even if they did direct the economy, this doesn't make them any less sympathetic to capitalism, and in fact was necessary to keep capitalism from eating itself alive. The state helps the capitalists shake down the working class during times of crisis. Wages are slashed, prices rise, and living standards plummet. While the state cuts benefits to the poor, it stands in for the consumer and offers contracts to failing businesses that guarantee the state as a consumer until profits return to acceptable levels. Rearmament was the perfect symbiosis of state and capital. The Nazis benefited from the economy supplying them with the means of war, while the capitalists received guaranteed sales and theoretically unlimited profits. In fact, capitalism exists thanks to the state, not despite it. States enforce lawful contracts and a monetary system. Hard to imagine capitalism existing without money. By now, we know how dependent capitalism is on the existence of private property. The state, with its monopoly on violence, uses the military and police to protect private property from the propertyless masses. Capitalism is, like an infant, completely dependent on the protection of a stronger other. Without the state enforcing contracts and protecting private property rights with the threat of violence, capitalism would die. As the greatest Italian behind Mario, Al Capone once said, "You can get much further with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone." Private property is the beating heart of capitalism, and without the state standing in as a bodyguard, it would be much easier for the masses to dismantle their oppressors and realize true democracy. Turn on the news and you will see video after video of the police beating, macing, and arresting protesters. You will never see the same happening to someone like Zuckerberg. The state tries, mostly unsuccessfully, to keep the contradictions that capitalism causes tampered down. On the one hand, the state enforces regulations on corporations so people don't bleed to death because removing fiberglass from the spaghetti was too unprofitable. And on the other hand, the state infringes on the rights of the majority by using its domestic military to keep them from rightfully dismantling the capitalist system. Hatred for the state originates in the capitalists' fear of it. The same state power that enforces private property and represses the tide of working class discontent can be seized by the working class and used against the capitalists. Since capital is defenseless without the state, they fear losing their control over it. Imagine if suddenly the army and police switched sides and aided the working class in seizing the means of production. First of all, that would be badass, and second of all, it's never going to happen because propaganda has been very effective in convincing us that the state is innately evil. In reality, the state is a political tool. Hitler's imperial war with Europe was waged in the name of corporate expansion. Newly conquered territories were used to continue the flow of profit into the veins of capitalists. Capitalism, with the help of the Nazi state, vampirically sucked resources out of foreign lands to selfishly continue its own existence. This is what I mean when I say that capitalism requires a state to survive. A state state's monopoly on violence ensures that capital is protected. The Nazi state even tried to protect capitalism from succumbing to its own greed. Investing in an imperialist project was essential for the long-term growth of German capitalism, but short-term greed blindsided most. They needed a stronger other, embodied in Hitler, to survive. Hitler's fascist revolution was not an economic one, but a cultural one. Private property was protected, and culture was revolutionized to align as much as possible with capitalist interests and eradicate from imagination itself the possibility of any alternative social systems. Displacement of popular blame was essential to the survival of fascism and capitalism. Hitler may or may not have been aware of the root causes of the social problems which plagued Germany. He admitted to learning much from Marx in his younger days. But one thing is certain, Hitler had a real hatred for the Jews. Anti-Semitism was an effective tool for converting fascism from an ideology to a material movement based on reality. Jews embodied all the evils of the social world, and thus by eradicating this flesh and blood, one could create real change in their lives. Greed was one example of a human behavior that was caused by the kill or be killed mentality of the capitalist economy, but was displaced onto the Jews to avoid taking accountability for the larger capitalist system. The Nazis, like the communists, correctly identified greed as a corrosive behavior which needed to be corrected. The masses agreed, as they had an unconscious awareness that their own poverty was caused by the greed of others. However, where the Nazis differed from the communists was who they placed the blame upon. Instead of the economy, which they remained dependent upon throughout their short-lived political existence, the Nazis blamed the Jews. This was especially convenient for those in power. The majority of Jews were not capitalists, like the Nazis claimed, but ordinary working class. Suddenly, the Jews found themselves in opposition to their communities. It is much easier to take out your anger on your Jewish neighbor than to revolutionize an entire economic system. And so, would-be revolutionary steam was let off by promoting in-group fighting among the working class. It was not the greed of the capitalists that was causing all their problems, but the Jews. This belief conveniently kept attention away from the economy, preventing a revolution. Jews were essentially sacrificed in order to trick the masses into believing the world was righting its wrongs. But everyone knows that two wrongs don't make a right. Right? Race was an essential pillar of Nazi ideology. Hitler's anti-capitalism was different from Marx's. While Marx believed private property was the root of evil, Hitler believed that only Jewish-owned private property was the problem. Jews served as the metaphorical waste bin to throw all of capitalism's contradictions into. Only Jewish capitalists were greedy, profit-hungry, anti-worker, and parasitic. If only Jewish property was transferred to Germans, all contradictions would be resolved and Germany would return to its former glory. Germans used private property productively for the good of the nation, and the Jews used it for the ruin of the nation. Of course, German capitalists were famously not greedy, profit-hungry, anti-worker, or parasitic. The 1% that we speak of today was defined as a cabal of Jewish capitalists seeking to destroy Germany. For Hitler, race was the essential bedrock that determined what society would look like and how it would function. The world was divided into two classes, Aryans and non-Aryans. Non-Aryans were to blame for all the world's problems. Recall that one of the few times the Nazis took away private property, they targeted Jews alone. The Simpson Company, a producer of light machine guns, monopolized the arms industry, a typical capitalist goal. However, the monopolization was blamed not on the Simpsons' capitalist nature, but their Jewish heritage. The Simpsons were arrested and accused of excess profits and extortion. The same never happened to Aryan-owned monopolies. In this way, blame was conveniently displaced away from the capitalists to prevent any revolutionary spirit. Anyone who is familiar with Marx's definition of class knows that focusing on race alone would never resolve societal contradictions. Class is defined by a group's relation to the means of production. If you own the factory, you are part of the capitalist class. If you depend on a wage and sell your time, you are part of the working class. One can see how race serves as a convenient replacement for this fundamental truth. Hitler believed he could ignore class differences and unite workers and capitalists together based on their racial identity. If you look like me and I look like you, we can dance together in the sun while I pick your pockets. If a Jewish capitalist stole wages and undercut unions, this was a crime of greatest importance. But if a German capitalist did the same, this was considered to be business as usual. The fundamental similarities between the German and Jewish capitalists were ignored. It is much easier to blame a person or group of people than an entire system. A person can suffer and feel consequences, but a soulless corporation can't. To control popular anger is simple. All you have to do is give the masses someone to look down upon and blame all their problems on. As Lyndon B. Johnson once said, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down upon and he'll empty his pockets for you. In Germany's case, Aryans were the in-group and Jews were the out-group. For Hitler, it was not capitalism that was the problem, but Jewish participation in it. So despite only being 0.7% of the population and owning no more than 1% of German capital, the Jews were blamed for manipulating up to 20% of the market. Of course, the other 99% of capital not owned by the Jews was mysteriously unaccounted for. Hitler's project ultimately failed because he tried to unite two antagonistic groups. Capitalists depend on the poverty of the working class while the majority constantly have to fight for better wages and working conditions. It is a mutually antagonistic relationship. It is like trying to unite oil and water. The two will never mix no matter how many world wars you start. Henry Turner suggested that what Hitler was trying to do was impossible. Ignoring class, he believed he could broker peace between workers and owners. Ignoring economics, he believed he could synthesize the central tenets of capitalism and socialism. He ignored these crucial aspects of society because he wanted to bring the German people together based on race. Hitler affirmed this himself. National Socialism always bears in mind the interests of the people as a whole, and not the interests of one class or another. The National Socialist Revolution has not aimed at turning a privileged class into a class which will have no rights in the future. Its aim has been to grant equal rights to those social strata that hitherto were denied such rights. This is especially convenient for the owning class. Race was an excellent distraction. People believed that someone who was their own race could not possibly exploit them. Only the other races, particularly the Jewish race, were capable of dishonest business. Ironically, fascism, one of the most divisive ideologies in all of history, begins in each country as an attempt to harmonize them. Hitler tried to claim that owners and workers were divided in their goals because they had been manipulated by the Jews into believing they had contradictory goals. Social equality was denied on an economic level but affirmed on a racial level. Hitler would say, "There are no such things as classes. They cannot be. Class means caste and caste means race. But with us in Germany, where everyone who is a German at all has the same blood, has the same eyes, and speaks the same language, here there can be no class. Here there can only be a single people, and beyond that, nothing else." In Hitler's fantasy, an Aryan worker was in every way equal to an Aryan owner. Never mind the fact that the Aryan owner was exploiting the Aryan worker despite their racial unity. In reality, fascism seeks to suppress the class struggle, not by abolition of classes, but by the violent permanent subjugation of the exploited classes to the exploiters and crushing of all resistance. Hitler even tried to blame Marx for class division. Marxism has driven a wedge into the populace, dividing it into two roughly equal parts that stood opposed to each other. One still loyal to sound national values and the other infected with a subversive internationalist creed that churned its adherents against their own nation. Notice that word equal. The fact that Hitler believed capitalists and workers stood on even ground is a very convenient narrative for those in power. It shifts the blame for the hardship people experience onto individual incompetence instead of systematic evil. Ironically, fascism, which tries to seek harmony between classes, actually makes the antagonistic relationship worse. Yellow Parenti said it best. Fascist doctrine stresses monistic values. One people, one ruler, one leader. The people are no longer to be concerned with class divisions, but must see themselves as part of a harmonious whole, rich and poor as one, a view that supports the economic status quo by cloaking the ongoing system of class exploitation. Fascism promises a revolution, but materializes a substitution of one form of domination for another. In peacetimes, capitalism can tolerate moderate democratic rights and accepts liberal ideals of equality, peace, and fraternity, as long as private property is untouched. There is still plenty of exploitation, but it has an aura of professionalism and civility which conceals it from the average eye. Capitalists would normally prefer not to use naked violence because it removes any doubt of the existence of class warfare. Psychological trickery is preferred as it is much harder to identify its source. However, when profits become tight, the true animalistic nature of capitalism is revealed. Exploitation, which was once subliminal, explodes into consciousness with great violence. In Nazi Germany, everyday class exploitation revealed itself when fascist gangs were first sent out to crush union activity. As Daniel Guerin said in Fascism and Big Business, stripped of all appearances, all the contradictions which dim its real face, all the secondary aspects which hide its essential character from so many, and all the circumstances peculiar to any one country, fascism is reduced to this: a strong state intended to artificially prolong an economic system based on profit and the private ownership of the means of production. When it comes to protecting its profits, capitalism would rather resort to concentration camps, gang violence, and political totalitarianism than concede to socialism. Fascism was acceptable because it stuck to murdering innocent people instead of private property. A time comes when the bourgeoisie can save its threatened profits only by exterminating the proletarian organizations and governing through terror. Then it digs up the old notions of barbaric epochs, it rehabilitates violence and adopts reactionary apologists of violence as its authorities. A perfect example of these apologists would be someone like Hitler. I majored in psychology in college. In one of my introductory classes, we learned that if faced with a stressful enough situation, an adult may resort to defense mechanisms that they learned as a child. A child that learned to stage a temper tantrum when it didn't get what it wanted will likely grow into an adult that will have a temper tantrum when they didn't get enough cheese at Taco Bell. In desperate times, when there are not enough profits to fulfill the greed of the rich minority, capitalism sheds the mask of respectable business and democratic procedure and resorts to the naked violence that sustained its rise in the first place. Why? Because like people, capitalism, when threatened, returns to behaviors it learned in its infancy to survive: remorseless, psychopathic violence. Some 400 years ago, capitalism first got its start by literally stealing peasants' land and enclosing it in barbed wire. As a result, millions of people were uprooted from their homes and traditional ways of life were slowly absorbed into the earthly hell of factories until they winked out like a star. Instead of indirect violence through economic austerity, like cutting welfare and public school budgets, direct violence on the body was used. Alongside the body, the very ability to imagine alternative social systems is attacked. Hierarchies of domination are naturalized. Exploitation, racial hierarchies, social Darwinism, and senseless violence become as inevitable as the sun. In Hitler's natural view of the world, all of society is based on race, a biological fact. The fundamental pillars of the economy and culture cannot be altered any more than height can be. Sorry, Looksmaxers. Those that became wolves and eat are those that are biologically pre-programmed to do so, and those that become sheep and get eaten must necessarily be biologically weak and thus predetermined to live life on their knees. Fascism is simply a modified form of capitalism. Call it hypercapitalism. All the predatory aspects of capitalism are magnified many times over. Landa makes the observation that capitalism, in the Nazis' view, is simply a part of nature. This is an opportune narrative for those in power. If people knew that social systems were not intrinsically linked to biology, they could begin to imagine alternatives. Imagination is not attached to biology. In fact, I believe most fantasy is created because of humanity's urge to transcend their biological limitations. And the truth is that almost half of Germany did imagine alternatives before the Nazis took power and did their best to crush any dissent. 18 million people proved their imaginations were not yet dead and gray. Unfortunately, the terrorists had won due to their superior economic support and the failure of the communists in fighting back in an organized fashion. Imagination of a better world was strangled in the cradle as children in schools were taught to view the domination of the weak by the strong as entirely natural, as immovable as the sun. As George Moose said in Nazi culture, within this culture there is no progression, no development, for truth was accepted as given, laid down forever by the race, as eternal as the Aryan himself. And of course this was unimaginably profitable for those in power. The less resistance there is, the less time, resources, and energy the dominating classes have to spend. And the less they spend, the more they keep. That's the whole point of this game we call life. Whoever you can divide, you can conquer. Malcolm X once said, "The greatest weapon the colonial powers have used in the past against our people has always been his ability to divide and conquer. If I take my hand and slap you, it might sting because these digits are separated, but all I have to do to put you back in your place is bring those digits together." More than anything, capitalism fears the Mike Tyson uppercut it would receive if it allowed the masses to identify it as a common enemy. Capitalism thrives on distraction. It needs the masses' attention to be diverted by anything so as not to leave any room for thought about revolution. A war, an economic crash, a natural disaster, terrorism, racism, patriarchy, poverty, destruction of community and democracy, or even going nuclear can all be taken advantage of to destroy working class solidarity. The more people are atomized, terrorized, and busy hating one another, the more entrenched capitalism becomes. The Nazis divided the population with race, anti-communism, warmongering, and anti-internationalism so the capitalists could sneak into the back door and conquer German civilization and beyond. Besides, what is a better distraction than a world war? While the confused and desperate working class was busy throwing bricks at Jewish-owned stores and killing each other in the millions, German titans of industry cornered their respective markets and made disgusting amounts of money. In some ways, it is unfortunate that the crisis of capitalism forced so many into the arms of such a poisonous ideology, which in hindsight obviously worked for the benefit of capital. The promise of a return to a past that was free from the violence and exploitation of modern-day society fueled desperately needed hope for a better future for the working class. A return to the past at the very least promised escape. Sometimes you just want to run and you don't care where it is you'll end up. Men want security more than freedom, and that for an indefinite time they may be successfully governed by a dictator who keeps in mind the maxim that contented cows give the best milk. People's deep desire for community and belonging to something bigger than themselves was exploited. People that were included in the in-group, the Aryans, were automatically part of a community that accepted them and valued their individual existences. If you were in, you were given a sense of equality with your peers. If you weren't part of the group, you were out of luck. Fascism has the advantage over socialism in that it despises the masses. It does not hesitate to conquer them through their weaknesses. Hitler hated democracy and often believed the masses were stupid and incapable of organizing their own lives. If the masses cannot govern themselves, they should be governed by a minority of men on whom nature has conferred exceptional ability, by a minority of leaders. In Germany, these leaders were the Nazi elite and the corporate executives, and they worked in concert to dismantle democracy entirely. Democracy, of course, is an institution which capitalism cannot tolerate, and neither could the Nazis. Imagine if workers had a real say over how profit is distributed and what it is used for. Imagine if the masses had a say over whether they were sacrificed in war or not. If this was really the case, a CEO wouldn't be able to get a third yacht. Can you imagine such horror? Imagine that. Fascism and capitalism share too many values to be separate from each other. In fact, they are intrinsically linked, not only economically but also culturally. Individuality is a central pillar that fascism and capitalism share. As Margaret Thatcher once said, "I am homeless, the government must house me." And so they are casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. Hitler would have happily agreed. Every man makes his own circumstances, and if things go wrong, it is not up to the community to lift you up. You only have yourself to blame. We tell homeless people to just go get a job. We tell single mothers to just go get a second job. Safety nets are destroyed because apparently they make people lazy and entitled. If you're at the bottom, it must be because you made independent choices that got you there in the first place. In America, if you are down on your luck, you have the freedom to be homeless and are labeled a weak biological defect. In fascist Germany, if you were down on your luck, you also had the freedom to be homeless and were labeled a weak biological defect, except you also ran the risk of being executed or enslaved and forced to perform hard labor. Cultural norms are a reflection of economic norms. What people value is shaped by how people relate to one another materially. Within capitalism, everyone's for themselves. Competition is naturalized and made as immutable as the laws of physics. As gravity exists, so does ruthless competition. Inequality is also by extension naturalized. Poverty is the result of inferiority. If only you worked harder. Antisocial personalities become virtuous. Lawless behavior, deceitfulness, aggressiveness, disregard for the safety of others, and lack of remorse are prized behaviors. These traits were highly valued in Nazi society. People with these traits were considered to be superior to all, except this is the exact diagnostic criteria which would get you sent to a therapist's office for antisocial personality disorder. In a capitalist world, being antisocial simply gets you further than being honest. Lying, cheating, and stealing are all encouraged because they give you a competitive edge. It's telling that the people Hitler believed to be superior would all do quite well if they entered the market. Perhaps if Hitler were born today, he would have been a day trader in his mom's basement. Society was and still is defined by the domination of the weak by the strong. In Germany, the strong Aryan was opposed to the weak Jew. Internationally, the Aryan was opposed to the weak everyone else. Economically, the strong capitalist was opposed to the weak worker. For Hitler, the owners of industry earned their keep by being born genetically superior to their workers. They had the right to lead them and discipline them as they saw fit. The workers had no right to negotiate for better wages and conditions due to their inferior biological makeup. A worm cannot make demands of a lion. So the story goes, competition was the motor of society. It would naturally result in the greatest and most productive individuals in society to rise to the top, where decisions that shape the future would be made. If they used unsavory methods to get there, it was their inherent right to do so, as society shouldn't restrict such individuals' powers. Similarly, America uses these meritocratic ideas to justify the rule of the many by the few. Never mind the fact that the majority of the rich were born rich, the vast majority of individuals are blamed for their inherent biological weaknesses. If one is not economically secure, they only have themselves to blame. Fascists valued productivity just the same as capitalists did. Productivity was defined by the amount of profit a worker could generate for an owner. Those who were disabled, either physically or intellectually, were considered to be a literal waste and should be discarded as such. In this way, the concentration camp was the perfect machine to discard all liberal niceties and do what capitalists always wanted in the first place: the literal incineration of human machines stamped as defective. Just like a truck that can't drive as quickly as it once could and is sent to the impound lot, humans with the inability to meet production quotas are destroyed. Their inability to produce sufficient profits determined their worth. People were seen as nothing but a means to an end. They were stepping stones to achieve the perfect machinery of domination which would yield the highest profits. Capitalism has no place for people considered to be unproductive, the unemployed, the sick, the disabled, and the socially ostracized, while normally supported by government programs, in times of crisis are discarded like trash. The murder of people with physical, mental, and psychological disabilities was also directly linked to economic concerns. It was intended to rid the economy of people who were considered a burden. Fascism, with its shameless violence, gives capitalists license to become judge and executioner. In the case of Hitler's Germany, workers who were dangerous to the bourgeoisie were systematically severed from society and forced to work under the threat of death. This is the ideal world for a capitalist. There are no longer any sleepless nights worrying about the next working class uprising. The sun of the Third Reich stretches its rays throughout the world and the shadows of the gallows disappear. There is no longer class warfare, but the ultimate dictatorship of international finance. Remember that all workers' rights were won with sacrifices of blood. The 8-hour workday, the end of child labor, the weekend serve as a reminder of all the graves dug. The concentration camp reveals what would happen without organized resistance to corporate power. Many seem to believe that class warfare is unnecessary and it is possible to negotiate with capital. The truth is that negotiation is impossible when there is a gun pointed at your head. The dog-eat-dog world becomes a real David versus Goliath story. Winners take all and losers literally lose their lives. Once capitalism dominates, everything is interpreted through the lens of cost-profit. If you are a cost, you are murdered, tortured, or deprived of human rights. If you are profitable, your life force is milked until you are drained. Hitler's conception of individualism was fundamentally different from Marx's. Hitler believed that the entire structure of culture, down to its foundations and each of its building blocks, is nothing other than the result of creative talent, the achievements of intelligence, and the industriousness of individuals. In other words, only the most talented and genetically gifted individuals make any real difference in the world. This idea is used to denigrate democracy. The unintelligent masses drag down the exceptional individuals to their level and destroy potential genius. Democracy is the rule of stupidity, of mediocrity, of half measures, of cowardice, of weakness, and of inadequacy. The incapable masses need strong, Christ-like individuals to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the whole. Hitler's main point was that individuals did not depend on the society around them to fulfill their potential. Competition freed the most creative aspects of humanity. In modern times, this individualistic idea is familiar in the concept of the self-made man. Dependence on others is seen as weak. With the destruction of social ties, the Nazis were able to unleash the most wicked individual appetites. Individual comforts were emphasized. The German individual, with his or her creativity, authenticity, courage, and initiative, was contrasted with the poisonous individuality associated with Jews. Jews embodied the worst of individualism, such as greed, inauthenticity, cowardice, and the ruthless pursuit of self-interest. German individuals were encouraged to spend time alone to cultivate the inner self. Capitalism rewards individuals with initiative, flexibility, and responsibility, qualities that were supposedly cultivated in Nazi Germany. All of this served one purpose: increase profits for Germany's largest corporations. Marx had a very different conception of individualism, one that was inconvenient for capitalists. First off, it contrasted between individualism and individuality. Individualism rejected the need for community and valorized self-made men who cultivated their inner selves in order to acquire more wealth, power, and status. Marx rejected this in favor of individuality, or the recognition that each individual contributes to a whole community which is more than the sum of all its parts. True individuality and the freedom that follows relies on the health of the community an individual is embedded within. Dependence on others is a necessary part of life. Alone, we are all helpless and weak, but together we are strong and free. Marx never wanted to subordinate the individual for the good of the community. In fact, he advocated the opposite. He recognized that the health of the individual reflected the health of the community. Strong community ties free individuals to explore themselves without restrictions. Progress is not the result of a few well-born geniuses, but from the collaboration of a tight-knit community. Everything one does is dependent on those who came before. The iPhone could not possibly have been invented by one person alone. Steve Jobs depended on thousands of years of human innovation in writing, math, engineering, and the arts. Could one man alone develop the necessary skills in all these areas to invent something so advanced as an iPhone? Maybe, but it would take at least 10 lifetimes. This is what Marx means when he says that a strong community is essential to individual growth. Each person depends on others to grow their food, clean their water, build their houses, and educate their children. One person cannot do the work of 20 people. The individual is able to think, feel, strive, and work by himself, but he depends so much upon society in his physical, intellectual, and emotional existence that it is impossible to think of him or to understand him outside the framework of society. It is society which provides man with food, clothing, a home, the tools of work, language, the forms of thought, and most of the contents of thought. His life is made possible through the labor and the accomplishments of the many millions past and present who are all hidden behind the small word society. In other words, a tight-knit community helps free individuals from endless tireless toil and gives them the time and energy to pursue the most human aspects of life: art, love, and pleasure. A man working 14 hours in the mines all day has neither the time nor the energy to love his wife, children, and especially himself. A person dependent on only themselves becomes bitter, selfish, and frankly quite evil. Capitalists forget that their existence depends entirely upon all the workers that they constantly step on. Within a socialist society, selfish gain is subordinated to the needs of the community, while the creative aspects of individuality are freed. Under capitalism, the opposite occurs. Selfish gain is freed to epidemic proportions, while creativity is destroyed in favor of assimilating oneself into the faceless consumerist crowd. People are encouraged to forget those they owe their existence to. Under capitalism, everyone drives a similar car, has similar hobbies, lives in similar houses, and has similar beliefs. One people, one ruler, one leader. Albert Einstein, who the Nazis tried to kill by placing a $50,000 bounty on his head, summarized it best: "I have now reached the point where I may indicate briefly what to me constitutes the essence of the crisis of our time. It concerns the relationship of the individual to society. The individual has become more conscious than ever of his dependence upon society, but he does not experience this dependence as a positive asset, as an organic tie, as a protective force, but rather as a threat to his natural rights, or even to his economic existence. Moreover, his position in society is such that the egotistical drives of his makeup are constantly being accentuated, while his social drives, which are by nature weaker, progressively deteriorate. All human beings, whatever their positions in society, are suffering from this process of deterioration. Unknowingly prisoners of their own egotism, they feel insecure, lonely, and deprived of the naive, simple, and unsophisticated enjoyment of life. Man can find meaning in life, short and perilous as it is, only through devoting himself to society. To be happy, you must devote yourself to the betterment of the community you are tied into. It is impossible to separate yourself from society, and individualism is a very dangerous lie that leads to the most destructive forms of violence that history has ever witnessed. Socialism doesn't ask us to be who we are not: selfish, greedy, manipulative, and untrustworthy. Socialism strives to fulfill all base needs, which then free individuals to explore themselves. In some ways, it is unfortunate that the crisis of capitalism forced so many into the arms of such a poisonous ideology, which in hindsight obviously worked for the benefit of capital. The promise of a return to a past that was free from the violence and exploitation of modern-day society fueled desperately needed hope for a better future for the working class. A return to the past at the very least promised escape. Sometimes you just want to run and you don't care where it is you end up. Hopefully by now, there is no doubt in your mind that Hitler represented the opposite of socialism. So why do accusations that he was sympathetic to Marx pop up every now and then, especially in recent years? Since at least the 1970s, accusations began appearing from right-wingers that Nazism is actually ideologically connected to the left wing. Why the blatant lies? If taken far enough, right-wing ideology leads to fascism. In order to gain power, right-wing governments in the West have had to not only painstakingly dissociate themselves from Nazism, but also make it synonymous with the left wing. So why did this begin happening during the 1970s? Startled by the rise of left-wing popularity, governments, especially Margaret Thatcher's in the UK and Ronald Reagan's in the US, began a new program of cutting social programs, weakening worker bargaining power, and decreasing wages called neoliberalism. They successfully convinced the public that government assistance programs and unions were actually harmful to the working class. Left-wing policies created a lazy, weak, and useless population which harmed the nation as a whole. Assistance was supposedly taken advantage of by lazy people while capable workers supported them. Some of you might remember the welfare queen panic. Unions were transformed into greedy institutions only interested in stealing wages in the form of union dues. Cutting taxes for the rich would create surplus wealth that would eventually trickle down into the pockets of the workers. Cutting social programs, destroying unions, and slashing wages were political moves that were all too familiar to those who lived under Nazi rule. Thatcher and Reagan were keenly aware of how close they were flying to the sun and wanted to avoid being associated with Nazi Germany, as this would result in none of their bills being passed. And so began the crusade on truth that still continues to this day. The Nazis were socialists who hated capitalism and wanted to destroy the world as we knew it. Neoliberalism rhetorically became about combating fascism instead of strengthening it. Strengthening the power of corporations became a positive because the Nazis sought to destroy capitalism. If the public didn't want concentration camps again, they were going to have to support right-wing governments. Cutting social programs was actually a positive because anything resembling government intervention was actually fascism, because the governments imposed themselves upon the free market. We began with discussing how Hitler alchemically converted lies into fundamental truths. Now, modern governments are using the same tactics. One can only imagine what the future holds if we continue down this path. Let's be adults and say the truth out loud. Hitler was not a socialist.